Thank you. I knew I had to do something before I told you who I was. So this meeting's going to be recorded. So if you don't want your face on the screen or to be recorded, please turn off your video. But you're welcome to stay and listen and ask questions. So my name's Joanne Russell, and I'm a barley geneticist here at the James Hutton Institute. And I'm going to introduce to you today Dr. Peter Martin. And Peter has an amazing CV, a completely varied and very interesting CV. And I'll come to the point once I introduce him as to why, how we know Peter. So basically, Peter did his first degree at Y College, and then went on to do his PhD at Long Ashton as a plant scientist. And following on from his PhD, he actually did a lot of traveling and spent 20 years working on tree crops. And so he spent many years working out in Malaysia. And in 2002, I guess you decided to settle down and come back to the UK. And he joined the Agronomy Institute. And Peter is the director of the Agronomy Institute, which is part of the University of Highlands and Islands. And this part is based in Kirkwall on Orkney. So he has an amazing view from his office. If you get a chance to go to Orkney, I would definitely go, because you really have to see where the best place in the world to work on barley is. And not only does Peter work on barley now, but Peter also works on one of the best barleys in the world, the bere barleys. And so we've known Peter probably for the last 10 years, when we've been looking at the diversity and the genetics of bere barley, and we've been growing. We've used it as an excuse just to go up there and plant some barley and spend some time in Orkney and well, I was going to say drink whiskey, but yeah, probably, and beer probably. So I'll stop rambling on, and I'll let Peter present to you some of the work he's been doing since he joined the Institute in 2002. Okay, over to you, Peter.
Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Joanne, for that introduction. Yeah, in this afternoon's presentation, I'd like to give you a sort of an overview of the work that has been carried on at the Agronomy Institute since it opened in 2002, aimed at trying to commercialize Orkney bere barley. And I'm hoping that after the presentation, you'll see that really this commercialization work has very much been aimed at trying to make the on-farm conservation of bere very much more secure than it was in the past. At the same time, attracting a few more growers into growing it, attracting some commercial companies to use it, and thereby sort of generating income for the commercial companies, the growers, and also providing sort of interesting products for the tourism industry. So I'm going to carry on, I think. What do I do now? Sorry, I'm trying to work the presentation, Joanne. Next
You
page.
should just press return. It should.
Oh, okay, there we are.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, technical glitch. Yeah, so to start with a little bit of background about bere. Bere is a traditional type of Scottish barley. Compared with most barley which is grown today on farms, most modern barley that is, there are a number of conspicuous differences. One of those is that it's a 6-row barley, so it has the grains arranged in 6 rows down the head. And you can see that in the photograph on the left. The bere is on the right of that photograph, and the 2-row barley is on the left. And the other major difference is the very long straw of bere. Although it's got long but weak straw, and you can see that in the photograph on the right, which compares bere with modern varieties. And until the 20th century, bere was probably the most important barley grown in the Highlands and Islands, largely because of its sort of special adaptations, which I'll mention briefly further on. It's an ancient crop. Originally, it was suggested that perhaps it was a Viking introduction dating back to about 800 AD. The current theory is, however, that it's quite a bit older than that, and it's possibly Bronze Age or even a Neolithic introduction, but that work is still ongoing, and I will say a little bit more about it later on. It's a landrace, technically, And this means that unlike modern varieties, it hasn't been interfered with, tampered with by plant breeders. It's basically the product of continuous selection by farmers and the farming system which they're using and the farming environment. And it sort of continually evolves to, like a process of, of, of natural selection. It sort of continuously evolves to try and perform as well as possible under the circumstances under which it's grown. But of course, it's the farmer who's actually making the selection. He's selecting grains from those plants which survive. Bere has some really remarkable adaptations to Scottish Island conditions. It produces a crop of grain in a very short time. So it comes to maturity probably about 2 weeks earlier than modern barleys, which are sown at the same time. Another major adaptation is its tolerance to very poor soils, of which we have a number, which you have quite substantial areas of very poor sandy soils in the Scottish Isles, and Bere has some very interesting tolerance mechanisms to these soils. Historically, Bere was a very versatile crop. It was multi-use, and of course this was important in a very geographically isolated part of the country where it was difficult to bring imports in. So Bere was used for human food, either as grain or milled into flour bear meal. It was used for making into malt, for brewing, and later on for distilling. It was used for animal feed, and of course the straw has always been important as well. And I suppose this really is in quite a contrast to modern varieties of crops, which tend to be bred for specialist purposes. So, you know, for example, you have special varieties for feed, special varieties for malting, special varieties for milling. When we started our work in 2002, there was really very, very little information or public awareness about Bere outside of the Scottish Isles. It really was a very forgotten crop. And the growing of it was restricted to the Scottish Isles, just a few growers in Orkney, some in Shetland, and a few on the Western Isles. And this was being grown for different sorts of end users. So in the Western Isles, Bere was grown together with landraces of rye and black oats and used as an animal feed on farm. On the other hand, in Orkney, Bere was being grown as a pure crop, and it was grown for bear meal, which was being produced by Barony Mill. And the bear meal has always been used in Orkney, and it was being used traditionally by local bakeries to produce bakery products. So when we opened in 2002, we were very keen to try and identify new markets for Bere, to provide income to growers, to help with its conservation on farm, being very aware of, with land races, you either use it or lose it. And we didn't want to lose Bere. And we were also very keen to try and develop unique products for the food drink industry. And in relation to those sort of desires, there were some really quite encouraging developments, I suppose, in the food and drink industry, in that it was at that point starting to become really very interested in unique products and products from special provenance. So
Peter,
we thought that...
Peter, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but there's a number of people on the call can't see the slides, and they get a message. They get a message saying that Peter is starting to share content. Could you perhaps just try and start sharing again?
Yes, okie doke.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's all right. No. Okay. Okay, is that any better?
Christoph? No. So everybody that can't see, I guess we can only apologize. Does it seem like a problem? Is it only a problem in Carlsberg? everybody else can see them, Christoph.
Maybe if they log off and back on again now that Peter's reshared, that might make a difference. I know they've already tried that. But sorry, I was doing something else there. I wasn't paying attention.
I don't know what we can do about this, Christoph, and others that can't see them. All I can say is that the session is being recorded. It will be on the website again once this is over, and maybe if you dialed into the recording of it on the website, you'll be able to see everything. So I'm really sorry about that. And Peter, I'm really sorry for interrupting you, perhaps. If you
No, that's okay. That's okay, Robbie, no problem.
If you want to continue, please do.
Okay, so shall I just carry on then?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. All right. So before I actually sort of go into details of what we've done, I just thought it might be useful to give you a very brief overview of what I'll be presenting. Our activities with bere have been divided into a number of areas. One of them, of course, is new product development. So this involves trying to develop new products using bere and developing the links with the commercial companies to use it. Another area of research which we've been involved in is into growing practices. So this is really involved at trying to find the best way of growing bere under modern agricultural conditions, with the aim of coming up with sort of guidelines for growers who might eventually become involved with our supply chain. A third area is seed multiplication. As with many growers of landraces, the first problem we had was that we only started with about 50 kilograms of seed, which doesn't go, a long way in terms of wanting to produce a supply chain. So we needed to bulk that seed up, and we need to of course, to also develop a supply chain so that we could produce much larger quantities of grain in the future. Another area which I think is really important to commercialization, but also to just general interest in bere, is trying to raising the bere's profile. As I mentioned, it was a crop which people knew very little about 20 years ago. And of course, not forgetting trying to find funding to do all of these various activities, which certainly in the early years was a very major challenge. So I'm going to start with sort of talking a little bit about the research that we did into the agronomy of bere. In 2002, there were a few growers of bere, but no one had really done any trials on bere to try to work out what was the best way of growing it under modern practices. Obviously, we started by talking to a number of people who'd grown bere in the past, and it was very clear that one of the major problems was its low yields. And also another one was lodging, which is when the crop falls over. And of course, one would expect that from bere because of its long straw. So we spent a number of years, several years, with a sort of a research trials program, which ran in parallel with the commercialization activities. And we did research trials looking at things like the time of planting. Now, the reason why we looked at this was because whenever we spoke to growers in the past, they always said that the time for planting bere was the middle of May. And so this was obviously something that we felt we had to investigate. And then other areas, of course, would have been things like using herbicide, using fungicide, using growth regulator, perhaps to control straw, and the response to fertilizers. So over a number of years, we did trials into this. You'll see in that paragraph, I've put ref 1. That means reference 1. And right at the end of this presentation, you will find a list of references. So these are sort of publications which we've contributed to, which if you are interested in finding out a little bit more detail, if you go to the last slide of the presentation, you can find the reference which might give you a little bit more information about it. So we had the trial. So basically, after probably about 4 years or so of research, 3 to 4 years of research, we thought we had a much better idea of how to grow the crop. And really, in the end, we decided that a low input approach was the preferable one for bere. The one thing we changed was, instead of traditional planting in mid-May, we went for planting as early as we possibly could in April. And the reason for that is to give earlier harvests and perhaps safer harvests where there was less risk of lodging because of rainfall. The other thing that we were very mindful of, I think, is that because of bere's long straw, we have to be very careful when we're growing it on high fertility soil, because again, lodging can be a problem. And also we tend to use quite low levels of nitrogen to avoid the risk of lodging, which is about sort of 55 or 60 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. The other risk of the other problem which comes in with lodging is that if the head stays wet for a long time, you can get grain pre-germination. This can be a problem with bere. So basically, that's sort of the results that came out of our agronomy research program, and we've tried to incorporate those into the guidelines for the supply chain. And probably this is the best point of the presentation to mention something about the supply chain. Our supply chain is managed by my colleague John Wishart, and normally it involves ourselves plus about 3 local growers per year. We provide the seed to our growers, and then we buy back the entire crop. Much of our grain goes for either distilling or brewing, but in spite of this, our grain, the contract we have with growers is quite lenient. We're not looking for specific grain nitrogen contents. We're not looking, so there are no penalties if grain nitrogen is over 1.65%. There are no penalties for small grain size, because this is all part and parcel of growing bere, I'm afraid. Obviously, the price we offer is higher than it would be for a modern barley. It has to be to compensate the grower for the lower grain yields that they get. But for the grower, an important calculation is that they do get a good crop of straw from bere. And this is very important for Orkney farmers. Within our sort of supply chain, we have to build in seed production as part of what we produce each year, simply because you can't go out and buy bere seed. And the other thing we have to do is we have to keep a significant quantity in reserve, just in case we have a disastrous harvest in any particular year. We do the grain drying for the supply chain. This is because this is such a crucial operation, so that the germination ability of the grain isn't destroyed. So we do the drying of the grain. Challenges for the supply chain, obviously for growers, low yields are still an issue. You're looking at 2.6 to 3.8 tons per hectare, depending on the year, depending on the inputs, and other factors. There is always a risk of crop lodging. It doesn't normally, you often get a lot of brackling with bere, which is where the straw crinkles and bends over. That's not too much of a problem. One can deal with that. But serious lodging does make combining difficult. And as I say, it does raise the risk of pre-germination. And during combining, the awns of bere can sometimes give major problems with blockages. So that's an outline of our own supply chain. Perhaps you should also bear in mind that on Orkney, there is a second supply chain, which is run by Bercy Heritage Trust. And it's of a similar size to our own. Going on now to some of the ways in which we've tried to help the commercialization of bere products. I'll start with bere meal. Bere meal is produced at Orkney's Barony Mill, which is run by Bercy Heritage Trust, and the mill has been working since 1873. And we think it's fairly consistently been producing bere meal each year since then. The mill was really important in terms of conserving bere in the latter part of the 20th century. If there hadn't been a market, even a small market for bere meal, it is possible that farmers might have given up growing bere on Orkney. So the presence of Barony Mill has been crucial to keeping Orkney bere surviving into the 21st century. The bere meal is used by local companies in bread, biscuits and bannocks, and you can see some of those in the bottom left-hand corner of the slide. Anyone who's not familiar with a bere bannock, that's the sort of the flat bread which you can see on the plate, the middle plate on the left-hand side of the slide. And although we haven't actually been too involved ourselves in bere meal production, where we have tried to help is that when we started, again, there was nothing really known about the nutritional value of bere. And so we've had a couple of projects which have looked at the nutritional value, trying to, and have developed nutritional profiles for bere meal and knowing a bit more about the nutritional properties of the grain. So these projects were one with the British Nutrition Foundation, and there's a paper that I refer to there which does give a profile of bere meal nutritionally. And then there was also some Scottish funded government work with the Rowett Institute, which looked at the nutritional content of grains. And these studies, they've highlighted the high fibre, things like folate, iron, iodine and magnesium in bere meal, and also higher levels of several constituents. We found higher levels of several constituents compared with modern barley varieties. Since recently, Barony Mill has sort of gone on from producing dehusked bere, which is very much like a pearled bere. That has also gone into the market recently. Our own work in sort of trying to develop new commercial uses for bere has largely focused on the beverages market, beer and whiskey. And of course, before we can get there, we have to actually malt bere. I mean, bere was very commonly used for malting in the past. There are many historical references to the use of bere malt, and bere malt itself was an important export from Orkney over a number of over hundreds of years. However, when we started looking into using it for brewing or distilling, there was undoubtedly a fair bit of skepticism from maltsters, from distillers, from brewers about using bere for malting. A lot of the objections were basic ones like, well, it's not on the recommended list, is it? So therefore we don't use it. Of course, it was also known to have high grain nitrogen. It's also known to have small grains, and that adds up to a lower alcohol yield on distillation. So economically, one could see why perhaps there was really reluctance to maybe try bere meal for alcohol production. And then there was also a little bit of concern about, well, if we're only dealing with quite small quantities, you know, maybe the bere is going to vary from year to year in quality, and this is going to end up with a commercial product which varies from year to year. And of course, a lot of breweries or distilleries, you know, they like to maintain a consistent, a standard flavor. On the other hand, some of the newer distilleries and breweries are quite happy to entertain the idea of changes in flavor with products. Other issues, of course, were things like the higher cost of the grain. I mean, I've mentioned to you that we have to obviously pay our farmers more for bere grain. And so that means that obviously anyone purchasing bere malt will also have to pay a lot more for it. And sort of constraints on doing it. There are not, when we started, there were very few facilities which were actually able to do some small scale malting of 1 to 5 tons. And looking at larger batch sizes, there were not that many which were able to deal with 30 to 50 ton quantities of grain. So it took a little bit of time for us to find collaborators, but in the end, I don't think no insurmountable problems were found in malting bere. It's really, I think the malting companies have been able to deal with it much the same as they would modern malting barleys. And over the years since 2004, we've had really very valuable, consistent long-term collaborations with Baird's Malt and Chris Malt with the bere. You might be wondering what the photographs on the left there under the underneath those sacks. That's actually a photograph in Barony Mill of some local making malt locally using an old technique called a sweet heap. And bere has been used in Orkney for making homebrew right up into this century. The photograph in the bottom left is Chris Malt's pilot plant for malting bere. The first commercial product which we went into, which we really helped anyone produce, was a beer. And sort of, again, looking into the sort of historical background of this, I mean, there are many, many historical accounts of brewing in Orkney, which and I mean the Norse Orkney Inga saga, which is about the Orkney earls, written probably in about the sort of dating back to the sort of 900s, 1000s, 1100s or so. Drinking and feasting was obviously a very important part of Viking culture, and social bonding really depended very much on it. So we can imagine that there would have been a lot of ale brewed in Viking times in Orkney, and we assume that that would have been bere. Historical accounts of Scotland in the 16th century also make the point that there was plenty of beer in Orkney, and that it produced the starkest ale of Albion, which I believe means the strongest ale. And as I've mentioned, home brewing with bere really survived into this century. So there are very good credentials for using bere for brewing. Our collaborations with breweries started in 2004 with Valhalla Brewery in Unst in Shetland, and from 2006 to 2017 they produced the Island Bere, which you can see on the top of that photograph. And then from 2013 we've worked with Orkney's Swanee Brewery, and Swanee Brewery has produced a number of bere beers. You can see that in the marketing of the product, obviously the Viking tradition and the heritage and the iconography is very important. You see lots of long ships, helmets, battle axes, and of course bere. A more recent innovation has very interesting one is Orkney Craft Vinegar's use of bere malt to produce a bere malt vinegar. And this has actually been endorsed on TV by several celebrity chefs and has been a really incredible product. Its sales have soared since those television programs, and it's a nice example of a sort of slightly unusual but higher value product being using bere. I guess the highest value products that we've been involved in helping to commercialize is whiskey. And of course, there are tremendous number of historical references to bere's use for distilling. And it would have been especially important in the Highlands and Islands. And when private distilling was still legal, it was a very important way for small rural communities to add value to a low value crop. So distilling has always been important to rural communities in the Highlands and Islands for that. And bere would have been used simply because no other barley was really grown in the Highlands and Islands area, because of the adaptations which bere has to this particular area. Its ability to grow quickly in the short growing season that we have, and its ability to tolerate the poor soils. And although bere went into decline in the 19th century, even in 1842, the statistical accounts record that 26% of the barley used by Campbelltown's distillers was still bere. Now, the reason why that figure exists is because I've mentioned bere's lower alcohol yield on distillation. At one point, there was a tax put on malt, and because of bere's lower alcohol yield, the rate of tax was lower on bere malt than it was on malt from other barleys, and therefore distilleries kept records of how much bere malt they used and how much other barley they used. But that's a little bit of an aside. I would say that bere was actually still being purchased by one of the Orkney distilleries into the 1920s. I mean, very small quantities, nothing significant, but it is indicative of bere's sort of continuing importance, especially in the islands. Our collaborations sort of with whiskey distilleries, they started in 2004 with Isle of Arran distillers, and that resulted in a one-off distillation, which resulted in an 8-year-old whiskey released in 2012, which is the one you see at the top of that photograph, and a 10-year-old one released in 2014. And then we have had collaborations with Bruichladdich Distillery since about 2005. And I think bere is really, I mean, I think we were incredibly lucky to be able to build up the link with Bruichladdich, because bere is so ideally matched to the distillery's aims and objectives, and they are very keen on exploring different types of barley. They're very keen on exploring the effect of different types of barley on the flavour of whiskey, and also they're interested in provenance and terroir. And so the thoughts of obtaining bere from Orkney fitted very well with their own sort of marketing objectives. And so after some sort of an initial sort of there was a very short period where a little bit of bere was being grown in Islay, but then we decided with the distillery that the best approach was actually to grow it in Orkney. And since 2007, our own sort of supply chain expanded, and we've been growing about 50 to 100 tons of grain annually. And most of that goes to Bruichladdich for whiskey production. And how Bruichladdich deal with the whiskey is that they release each annual crop is sort of stored separately, and so each annual production is released as a special vintage. So you have, for example, Bere Barley 2011, which was distilled in 2011, but it would have actually, just to add a bit of confusion to the story, it would have been produced from the Bere Barley crop we grew in Orkney in 2010. But you can see basically there is a vintage which corresponds to each year of growing. I mentioned the collaboration. Obviously, I think for ourselves, one of the very useful things about this collaboration is that Bruichladdich are very keen on the bere story, and of course they tend to promote it on their own website and through social media, and this of course is a very useful way of promoting bere. It means that we don't have to put too much effort ourselves into putting things on our own website. Bruichladdich are quite good at picking up what is happening in bere research. So the sort of final section that I want to talk about is just raising bere's profile. And I think I've sort of hinted at this before. This is very important for commercialization because it helps to make commercial companies aware of bere. It's also very important for trying to get growers interested in bere. I think it's also important in making potential funders aware of bere. So profile raising is really important. Obviously, we do it. We've done it sort of through the traditional means, which is engaging with social media, putting things onto websites, producing publications, having field days and field events. But in this section, I'm not going to mention any of that. I just want to concentrate on a few other things which I think are interesting aspects of raising the profile of bere. And the first thing I want to highlight is how important the commercial products are in raising bere's profile. And in a way, raising bere's profile and commercialization, it's a little bit of a virtuous circle. You know, the one reinforces the other. The more commercial products you have, the more they are advertised and the more people become aware of bere. And similarly, the more awareness there is about bere, the more likelihood is that new commercial companies will start to become interested in using it. So that's just one point I'd make. And of course, in profile raising, whiskey is a particularly good product because it is such a high profile product. I mean, for many years, the bere whiskies from Bruichladdich were in a number of international airports being sold around the world. We could not have done anything. We couldn't have done any sort of publicity which would have taken bere to other people on that sort of scale ourselves. The other sort of area that I'd like to raise is through a number of multidisciplinary research projects in which we've been involved, there are some really fascinating, amazing bere stories developing, which again, I think have a lot of potential for raising bere's profile. And I'm sure that some of them will be used by people marketing bere products. So I just want to mention some of those profile raising projects, if you like. And I would say probably foremost amongst those is the work which has been led from the Hutton, in which we've been involved, which Joanna mentioned, which is on the tolerance of some types of bere to manganese deficient soils. You can see a photograph there which shows a few sort of fairly poor yellowy green looking plants and some very dark green lush plants. And the dark green lush is the beres, are the beres which are tolerant to this nutrient poor sandy soil we have out at Bury. So this is the trait which is being people are particularly interested in at the Hutton. And of course, the value of this is to try and get this trait into modern varieties to make them more tolerant to make them more sustainable and more able to cope with poorer conditions. And I should say that the trait is present in some beres. Mostly it seems to be absent from modern varieties. I'm not going to say any more about that though, because I'm sure at some point in the future there's going to be a seminar talk by Joanne and Tim probably on this topic. So going on to the other area, which other sort of interesting story which I wanted to mention, and that is when was bere first introduced to Scotland? How old is bere in Scotland? You know, we really don't know, but we're starting to get some hints about this, and the sort of the work that's going on, which we think is shedding light on this, is firstly there's comparison of the bere genome with those of other barley landraces, and another area of work is an analysis of grain shapes of surviving landraces, including bere. And again, I'm not going to give you very much information about this because it's quite a complicated area, but if you are interested in reading more, you can see the references 5, 6, and 7 there. But basically, the results of both of these areas of work are seeming to appear to indicate that it's very unlikely that bere was the Viking introduction, which had been suggested previously, and that it's more likely that perhaps it could go back to a Bronze Age introduction. And this is when we start to see 6-row hulled barleys, which is what bere is, starting to become much more common in the archaeological record. There's even a remote possibility, I guess, that it could be a Neolithic introduction, but I'm sure in the future we're going to learn more about that, and it's going to be a really interesting story. The other sort of story developing, which I'd like to sort of talk a little bit about, is the possibility that, I mean, we talk about bere as being, you know, a Scottish barley, a traditional Scottish barley, which undoubtedly it is. The historical references are very common for Scotland, but it is also mentioned as a north of England crop in the in the 16th century. There are also very widespread references to bere being grown in Ireland. And one of the really interesting results which came out of the genotyping of bere land races and and Scandinavian and old European land races was that while bere and Scandinavian land races are distinct genetically, there were two Scandinavian land races which actually fall into, they're very, very closely related to bears. In fact, they're so closely related, they could be bears, but I don't think any of us would want to necessarily call them bere at this stage. And those come from the Faroes. And this is quite interesting because possibly how did they get to the Faroes? One theory is that they were introduced in fairly recent times, let's say in the last couple of 100 years, perhaps by informal trade links between the Faroes and the Northern Isles. On the other hand, we know that when the Faroes were settled, a number of the settlers that went to the Faroes came from Norse settlements in Scotland and Ireland. Might they have taken bere with them to the Faroes? And in which case, could these Faroese land races actually be descendants of some of that material that might have been taken by settlers from Scotland to the Faroes? And of course, that then, I mean, if that was the case, and I'm saying, and it is a big if, but if that was the case, perhaps settlers going to Iceland, where we know barley was grown up until the 1500s, perhaps they might have taken bere to Iceland as well. So this, you know, quite suddenly, we've got the possibility that we may not be dealing just with a Scottish crop. We may actually be dealing with a very old crop, which has North Atlantic significance. But there we are. That is a sort of a story which is ongoing. Another sort of the bere stories, I suppose, is a recent collaborations we've had with the Food Cult project, which has used bere using sort of experimental archaeological methods to try and replicate brewing of an Irish beer during the 16th century using bere and oat malt, and that is going to be used for nutritional analysis. Or so I'm sure they'll also be drinking it though. But that again gives a nice example of how useful bere could be because of its antiquity, the value of bere perhaps for experimental archaeology in the future. So I think that sort of basically concludes what I want to say about the contributions to commercialization. So sort of basically in conclusion, since 2000, the development of new markets for Orkney bere, it has resulted in quite a significant increase in the area of bere grown in Orkney, probably from about 5 to 70 hectares now. This has made the in situ conservation of bere quite a bit more secure than it was when at the beginning of the century. It's also provided income to growers, and it supplied unique ingredients and income to commercial users and the tourism sector. And the new research on bere's traits and history is raising its profile, providing a lot more information about what really has in the past has been a very neglected Scottish crop. And really it's sort of stressing its value, its genetic value, but also its heritage value. And so although on-farm conservation is more secure in Orkney, I'm still very, very aware that markets can be fickle. They can very quickly disappear and change. And so therefore I do think it's very important to ensure that a diversity of end users of bere is that we identify a diversity of end users moving forward. Also, it's a salutary reminder that growing of bere, in spite of the success of Orkney bere, in Shetland, bere has virtually ceased to be grown. It's still grown on the Western Isles for animal feed, but its seed production of bere and the other cereal land races, I understand, is threatened by things like geese. So, you know, although we've got some nice success stories with bere, I do think we need to be, you know, we've still got a lot to do to maintain its security into the future. So basically, that's all I would like to say. I'll just sort of finish very quickly with a slide showing acknowledgements to various funders, commercial companies, research centres that we've collaborated with. And then there was this final slide, as I mentioned, of the references. But I mean, that will be available when the presentation is put on the International Barley Hub's website. So thank you.
Thanks, Peter. That was really good. There's a few questions already in the chat. And
Yeah.
I don't know if the people asking the questions would like to ask them or if they're happy for me to read them out.
Would you like me to stop sharing so that yeah.
Yes, that would be good. Then you can sort of have a look.
Okay. Yeah.
You can see the people who are asking the questions. Victoria, do you want to ask your question or are you happy for me to read?
Read.
Oh, I'll read. Okay. So Victoria Dyke is asking, or a comment about a potential small market for beer would be historical farm sites. So as a crop that's grown better than contemporary crops on these sites. And also historical reenactment groups would be interested in buying grain for their use in these types of activities. Again, a small amount, but you know, potentially increasing the profile, I guess, of beer.
Yeah, I do. I think that would be a really nice way of using it. I mean, not just bere. I do think I did mention in the presentation that on the Western Isles, bere is grown with black oats and with rye, and certainly, you know, there is a need, I suppose, for more seed availability of all of these these landrace crops. Seed. I mean, I wouldn't want to get into too much detail, but if the one issue, the one problem we have had with selling seed is that if it is sold as seed, it does have to go through. There's a procedure it has to go through to be inspected by the various authorities and things, even though it is a land race. So, but I mean, if it is just supplying grain, if you like, for processing purposes and things like that, that's not an issue.
The second question is from Robbie, and Robbie asks that beer is grown on low nitrogen, so yet the grain in the nitrogen is high. Grain nitrogen is consistently high. So he's asking if you know if this is genetically controlled, related to low yields or high residual or bioavailable nitrogen and otherwise nutrient poor fields.
No, I'm afraid we don't really know anything about. We don't know where the bere is a nitrogen. I mean, it would be nice to think it was a nitrogen efficient variety, and again, that might well be, you know, for the future. That could be another trait. I mean, one would imagine that over thousands of years of being grown on poor soils, possibly with quite low levels of fertilizer and things, that it might well have developed a trait for being quite efficient in the way it uses nitrogen.
Yep. Next question from Ian Mackay. Are there trait differences between beer grown in the Western Isles for animal feed and beer grown in Orkney?
In the we've run for a number of years now. We have run trials together with Joanne and Tim and others at the Hutton, looking at a whole range of bere accessions. So this is bears which were originally came from the Western Isles, bears which came from the Northern Isles, and we've put them all into a trial in the same place. Visually, there's not a lot of difference between the bears, but one thing we have noticed, and that is that the bears from the Western Isles tend to reach heading a bit later than those from the Northern Isles. And this might well be related to the fact that the Western Isles tend to be a bit warmer than the Northern Isles.
Okay. So Robbie, you've got another question. I'll let you ask it.
Okay, let me find it first. Yeah, it was a simple question. You mentioned a lot about adaptation to the environments on Orkney and the Western Isles. Have you any idea why shorter, sturdier beers weren't selected over time, given the issues that you talked about with lodging and brackling? Is it anything to do with the historical use of long straw as a building material?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one, Robbie. I mean, the straw is used in Orkney for making into rope. I mean, it's not a strong rope, but the rope is used within a thatching. Traditionally, it is used in thatching of Orkney, old Orkney houses. And I mean, obviously having a longer straw would be useful for that purpose, but I can't imagine that that would be necessarily a major driving force in farmer selection. The one thing we do, the question of lodging and brackling of bear is an interesting one, and this is that as we get close to harvest, the head of bear, it starts fairly laxed, and then as you get close to harvest, it sort of drops over and droops in the general canopy of the bear. So unlike modern short-strawed barley, where the head is very much held up by the straw and is very exposed, with the longer straw of the bear and the brackling, the heads all tend to be within the general mass of the canopy. And we do wonder, I mean, it's not unusual as you get close to harvest to have pretty disastrous gales in Orkney. And when you do get really strong wind, we have known a lot of, head stripping can be a major problem of heads which are exposed. And so, we're wondering whether the long straw and this sort of brackling habit helps to protect the bear against drastic loss from the really strong winds that we can get around harvest time.
Interesting.
Probably leads to more of the seed if it is stripped.
We need a few years research in a wind tunnel, I think, Joanne.
There's a question here from Ernesto, and Ernesto has a nice collection of actually Spanish land races, so 6-row Spanish land races, and he's asking whether we keep the bear barleys as diverse populations, or have we developed inbred line cultivars?
I think I'll leave it. Well, I mean, for the bear which we grow in Orkney, when I say we, that's the Agronomy Institute. We obtained our bear from Bercy Heritage Trust, from Barony Mill. And so if you like, that's sort of one, and it would probably be equivalent to one of the accessions which Joanne has in the bear in your barley collection, I think, Joanne. We do not do, the Agronomy Institute doesn't do anything in terms of deliberately trying to cross our bear to maintain variability or anything like that. We just sort of accept what comes out of the field. But I think you would possibly be more, you'd be a better person to answer that sort of question, I think, Joanne.
Yeah, I mean, we try and keep them as pure stocks, but they do like to get mixed up with other things, especially when they lodge so bad. You know, I mean, obviously we're growing them down here, and we do give them probably too much fertilizer, and they do lodge and fall into other plots. So it's quite a job to keep them as pure as we can, but we do try. But they're not the easiest to work with.
Yeah.
So from Pierre Pin, one of the barley breeders, nice piece of work, and he's asking, is the bere genome assembly already available? And also, do we plan on developing a non-GN bere type for distilling? So
Okay. Well, on the on the GN side, we were a little bit. We have approached maltsters about bere and GN. They were not concerned at the GN levels in bere. I think it would fall into the category of what is a low producer of GN. So this was not a concern to us, but obviously it's not a non-producer of GN. But I'll let you answer the other part of the question, Joanne.
Yeah, I mean, we have crossed the beres into several recommended list varieties, so we can potentially especially low GN or non-GN types like Concerto, and so we could actually identify beres that were, or individual lines that were probably non-GN beres. As far as the genome assembly is concerned, we're on it at the moment, which is and hopefully in the next probably 6 months we will have probably a reference level bere Unst, and that's one of the ones from Shetland, which is one of the ones that's particularly grows particularly well on poor manganese soils. So we are developing some tools for the bere lines as well. Liz Dinney has asked, could it be the case that your commercialization and close association with Orkney has almost been too successful, hence its decline in Shetland and Western Isles? So could you marketing it as a North Atlantic grain address this at the risk or weakening the close association with Orkney? And Liz Dinney is a social scientist, so she's interested in from more of the social aspects of it. And she really enjoyed your presentation.
Okay, right,
I
thank
think
you.
everybody does.
Yeah. I mean, I think the story from Shetland is a very sad one, because I mean, we've been in link. Well, we've had sort of links with the Shetland growers ever since the Agronomy Institute opened in 2002, and the growers have sort of become older, more isolated, and I think the lack of any market for bere has really just meant that they've only been growing it for their own sort of purposes, and it all seems a bit pointless to them. And also now that it does another issue which seems to arise once you start growing small plots of cereals is that things like bird damage and that sort of thing starts to become much more serious. And certainly the Shetland growers have complained about this, is that sometimes they've sown their bere, but then it's been absolutely devastated by sparrows. So I mean, I think that, I mean, perhaps there is a point in that. I suppose obviously we've concentrated on Orkney bere because being part of Orkney College, we're based in Orkney, and therefore we obviously have we have a responsibility to local growers. We are only a small research centre. There are 2 of us, so there is a limit to how much we can get involved elsewhere. We do have a current project which has just started over on the Western Isles with North Uist Distillery, trying to help them to multiply up we're giving them some advice on growing bere so that they can start a supply chain there for distillation, so that they can use bere for their own whiskey. On the Western Isles, though, the use of bere, the rye, and the black oats is a very important one. And I think as long as we can maintain the seed stocks for the farmers, that use is probably likely to carry on, because basically I don't know that a mixture of modern varieties at the moment would actually be able to perform on the very poor soils that they have.
Yep. I think that's one of the keys, isn't it? I mean, the problem we've got is we have collections of about between 30 and 40 different bears from across Shetland, Orkney, the Western Isles, but you know, we only keep very small stocks, and so actually multiplying them up and distributing them is always going to be a major issue. So it's, you know, it's not the easiest thing to do. We've got a few more questions. Malcolm Macaulay has asked, has there been any attempt to extract genetic material from those archaeological carbonized grains, or are they just soot?
Yes, when we originally started a collaboration with the universities of Manchester and Sheffield, really looking into this, and what we did was they were sent bare material from the trials. So this is the modern types of bere, and sorry, they were sent the modern grain, so grains which have been grown recently from all the various accessions which Joanna has, but we also sent to them carbonized grains. And the original idea about trying to find bere in the archaeological record was to see whether any DNA ancient DNA could actually be extracted from the carbonized grains. However, it does appear that the carbonization process destroys the DNA, and it was not possible to extract ancient DNA from the carbonized barley. And that was really why we then ended up going down the route of not we, but our collaborators at Sheffield went down the route of the morphometrics of the grains.
Yep.
And also studying the genome as well.
So I think there's one more question from Victoria, and she's asking whether bere would likely grow in any of the other poor soils away from the North Atlantic climate. So maybe what we could do is we could swap some seed with Ernesto in Spain and see if we can get Ernesto to grow them down in the southern part of Spain in Zaragoza, and see if we can how well they grow.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, again, sort of thinking of archaeology and the spread of bere. I mean, this trait which you, Tim, and the Hutton have discovered with the tolerance to the manganese soil is, I mean, it's really important. Historically, it must have been important. I mean, we know that modern varieties, unless they get a spray of manganese on these soils, they fail. They don't produce grain. So if you go back a couple of thousand years, presumably, I mean, these sandy soils, they were used for agriculture. So the barleys that they were growing on those soils, presumably must have had the trait. I mean, unless there are unknown ways of fertilizing the soils, which can perhaps supply the manganese and the copper and the zinc. But it may well be that you know, there was a certain amount of speculation that bere could go back to Bronze Age or even Neolithic times. I mean, maybe this tolerance to manganese, it's an ancient trait, and it might well have been present in the barleys which were brought along the Mediterranean coasts into Spain, into coastal Spain, and then up into coastal Scotland and Wales. You know, it could be a more ancient trait than we suspect.
Yeah, because if it had come, say, with early Neolithic settlers from the Middle East, it would mean it would quite possibly survive successfully in their climates, which would mean quite a few countries where they have poor soils and can't afford things like the GM crops, where they have to buy the seed each year. They can't take seed from the previous crop. That would be quite a good potential route forward for getting a degree of self-sufficiency in their crops.
Yes, I agree. Yes.
Okay. I think we're at the stage where we've exhausted all of the questions, and I would just like to thank Peter again for a really interesting talk, and also I would like to advertise the next talk. And you're not it's not a mistake. That really is. We really are having a talk from Australia next time in 2 weeks' time, and this is one of the Barley Community Initiative talks. And again, it's on the 2nd of June, and I can't remember the exact time. Robbie, can you remember what time we're doing this talk? Is it early morning or?
It is early morning. I think it's 9 o'clock in the morning.
9 o'clock. So we'll send out more details. So again, just to thank Peter for his really interesting talk, and you'll get a follow-up talk from us on the manganese and where we are with the genetics. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming, everyone. See you next time.
Right. Okay, thank you all very
Bye.
much. Cheerio.
Thank you.